editor of The Times, James Harding, said that one of the reasons that his newspaper hadn't followed up The Guardian's coverage in July 2009 was because the police was refusing to give the story any credence. He also said that less coverage was given to phone hacking before 2011 because of the tendency to see an agenda when one news organisation is reporting on the activities of a competitor. And indeed, the newsworthiness of this story was also attacked by representatives of News International and other newspaper journalists who portrayed The Guardian's story as part of a politically motivated left-wing campaign or commercially interested anti-Murdoch crusade. One interesting sort of series of disputes have come via Richard Caseby, the managing editor of The Sun, and he's used his appearances at the parliamentary committees to criticise The Guardian. And in December last year, he accused the paper of sexing up their coverage of the phone hacking story. So perhaps that again demonstrates the subjective nature of assessing newsworthiness, and it's even more pronounced when the media industry covers itself. So as we've said in this paper, this really does show that news organisations' newsworthiness is subject to these overlapping personal, professional, political and commercial dynamics. And as a consequence, many journalists and editors have come to regard the phone hacking story as anything but newsworthy for a substantial period of time. And it was a failure of the media's role as an accountability mechanism in the public interest in that instance. And now Daniel's going to talk about sort of, a more productive suggestion that we've got in terms of holding that to account and monitoring it more closely.
Thanks, Jude. So the failure to report the phone hacking scandal has, of course, been fairly well documented. But we might look at other stories as well. So we might look at the financial crisis in 2008, the failure of the media to scrutinise financial institutions there. We might also look at the run-up to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003. As Jude has demonstrated, working out why journalists regard some stories and angles as newsworthy and not others requires significant analysis. But we don't even have a systematic way of understanding and monitoring what news stories are being published in this country or how they are being covered. This is beginning to seem a little bit strange to me in an era when we can collect and organise data on a vast scale from online news articles. There's no longer any reason why the news values of the media couldn't be monitored in a more coherent manner for the benefit of the future of journalism. For this paper, we are able to trace all news articles relating to phone hacking over a 4-year period, and academic research has benefited from things like the Nexus database, which allows searchable access to decades of news articles. But research which considers all news topics is often limited to only a few media outlets for a very short period of time. In the past, it would have been exceptionally time-consuming, if not impossible, to conduct an annual survey of all the news that was covered on every topic and subject. But today, nearly every news story that appears in print also appears online, and news is relatively straightforward to archive digitally. By harnessing the potential of big data and digital search tools, we're able to design a more sophisticated piece of software which could be used to provide the public with an annual audit of all UK media content over an entire year. Data from news stories could be accessed to produce a breakdown of what news subjects were reported, how they were reported, by which journalists, how often and with how much prominence. This data might be analysed in conjunction with data provided by audiences from clicks on web links and the number of times articles have been shared by web users on other websites. Information, in fact, that's already being collected internally by news organisations. This annual review could go beyond newspapers, a category of increasingly dubious relevance in a convergent media world, to cover all major online news sources, whether they're newspapers, broadcasters, new media websites or influential bloggers. Independent researchers can then analyse that data to write an accessible and publicly available report on the nature of all UK news content over a year. A report which would provide the public with a more detailed understanding of how and why news is covered. An annual review of this nature is not only possible, it's already being done outside the UK. In the United States, the Pew Research Centre's State of the News Media report analysed 46,000 stories from 52 news outlets in 2011. The report offered a comprehensive understanding of which news stories and topics were regarded as newsworthy by American journalists. Its report included news being covered by bloggers and Twitter users. And there's also an interactive online feature which allows the public to make their own comparisons of how news was covered in different media outlets. We believe it would also be useful to combine this approach with that of the Media Cloud project, which is a project run by the Berkman Centre for Internet and Society. This project includes an open source online tool which highlights which keywords were used in relation to major news topics on a weekly basis by individual organisations. In the UK, perhaps the closest thing we have to anything similar is journalisted.com, which is run by the Media Standards Trust. This website monitors articles written by individual journalists, and it has a weekly and yearly roundup of which news topics are covered lots or covered little. This is a useful starting point, but the depth of data and analysis is limited compared to the US projects I've just outlined. An annual audit of UK media content undertaken by an independent organisation would only be a small part of a much more wide-ranging solution to the issues raised by the phone hacking scandal. It wouldn't illuminate journalist decision-making, nor hold them to account prior to publication. It wouldn't deal with newsroom culture, which Jean Seaton was talking about earlier. But it is a practical step forward, which would provide a comprehensive overview of what the news and the trends in the way those news stories are reported. It would provide an accountability tool that could benefit both news organisations and the public. For journalists and editors, it would be a resource, allowing them to reflect on the shape of their coverage over a year. And for academics and the wider public, it would provide a much more informed starting point for debate on how and why news media covers certain news topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we'll just take two questions. So, John.
Could you tell us what will the actual criteria be for this audit you're proposing? How is all this going to make the world a better place? Telling us how many articles have been published on a particular thing doesn't do very much.
Yep. I think it would be very useful to have an annual auditable news accounts because a lot of people say a lot of things about how news is covered, and a lot of this is actually based on any data or evidence. For example, if you compare the way CNN, if you look at 2011, for example, you compare the CNN coverage of the first quarter of 2011 with the Fox News coverage of 2011, you can see that for every national news story that CNN covered, they covered an international news story as well, whereas Fox News only covered about 15% of international stories and 80% of national news stories. And you can also see that CNN's coverage, although it was massively influenced by the Arab Spring, in fact, their overall percentage of international news coverage hasn't actually changed. So people arguing, for example, that because of the Arab Spring we're now more internationally focused as a news media, I wouldn't agree with that, because actually CNN's news coverage has gone back to where it was, and the Arab Spring can be seen to be an extraordinary news event.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very useful to actually look at what's not covered as well as what is covered. I think that is interesting. But I would recommend one thing to you. I mean, looking at how things are covered, how stories are covered in the media which are about the media. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing there would be the press coverage of the so-called super injunction spring. When we had this conference last year, we just come to the end of the super injunction spring. Most of the reporting of the injunctions was completely and utterly and totally factually inaccurate, because first of all, they weren't super injunctions, they were simply anonymised injunctions. And the self-interest and the distortion in the press coverage of those stories about injunctions, and I don't just mean, by the way, in the tabloid press, was really quite remarkable. I've not actually seen very much that's been written about that. I don't know whether you two have done it.
Yeah.
Well, it was good.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is actually one of my other case studies that I'm looking at in terms of selective reporting, and I've made the argument that really if more data had been available from the courts in order to inform the public about what was going on, we could have actually challenged some of the media coverage of so-called super injunctions, which you can go into legal definitions, and really was quite meaningless as a broad category, and had very mixed coverage. Maybe some places covered them a little bit better than others, and I tried to do basically an audit of what we could actually categorise as different types of injunctions. Because there was I think a very real concern about injunctions. Sorry, this is slightly getting onto a different point, but injunctions where you couldn't even report the existence of the injunction. That was a concern with something like the Trafigura case. But then this then got this label then got applied to, you know, sort of cases involving footballers and anonymous privacy injunctions, which is a slightly different issue. But so I think that's exactly why we need to be monitoring these.
What's so interesting is that the real super injunction story, Trafigura, was barely covered by the press at all. The other thing that's interesting is that if you actually go and look at some of the judgments in the judges there in the privacy injunction cases, there's a lot of criticism of the press coverage in some of those judgments. Criticism which appeared absolutely nowhere in the press at all, not even in the Guardian, as far as I remember.
Well, I mean, there's cases where I've seen a judgment where a judge has taken a journalist to task, and that's barely got any pick-up anywhere or anything. I mean, that's quite a serious thing, I think, for a judge to really criticise one particular journalist for something, the way they get, and this was, I think, a family law case. Yeah, it was, yeah. But that had no traction. That didn't get picked up. It wasn't commented on, you know, maybe on the UK Human Rights blog. I'm not sure if anywhere else picked it up. But I think that's incredibly important. And the more I look at these, especially the way the courts are reported, I just think it's so important to draw attention to the way that the media reports its self-interest. And if we had some kind of credible authority or a set of data that we could sort of hold them to hold them accountable with, that would be a useful mechanism, I think.
So thanks very much. We're about to move on now. Now we have James Rodgers from Bennettm University, who's going to talk about journalists, the law, regulation and technology. Roughly.
Something like that, yeah, thank you.
I'll warn you when you've got 3 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you. This paper is part of an essay that I'm working on, so I crave your forgiveness in advance if at some point it doesn't seem to follow. I've tried my best to condense it last night into 15 minutes, and then this morning, just now, I learned that I've got 12 anyway. We'll see if I can rattle through it. The first part of my title I hold to be self-evident, up at least as far as the colon there. But I think it's not being considered carefully enough, and that's what I want to discuss in this paper. Journalism, I will argue, needs to stand up for itself and needs to be allowed to do so. Let us not forget that The Guardian and the New York Times, perhaps arguably more than any detectives, are to thank for the fact that these apparently corrupt ties between politicians, police and press barons are now being investigated. Remember too, and I think this has been forgotten in a lot of the public debate which has followed the phone hacking scandal, if not by journalists themselves, that Marie Colvin and Anna Politkovskaya were journalists as well as Clive Goodman. And of all the thousands of words which have been written about the Lofgren inquiries so far, there's one particular article which stays in my mind, and it's from Peter Preston's column in The Observer earlier this year, a column which I read to take, perhaps reluctantly, to accept that regulation is going to inevitably follow. This is what he says. This is how he concluded his column in The Observer one Sunday this February. History, he said, doesn't provide a resounding lesson for Lord Justice Leveson to carve in stone. It merely underlines the absence of permanence in a deeply impermanent world. Now, that idea of an absence of permanence, I think, is key to our understanding of how we should approach these issues. I came in a little late to the first session and was rather dismayed to hear all the participants making a strong case for regulation. Only later, when Professor Seaton referred to the fact that in some ways we were fighting the war of 20 years ago, did I start to begin to agree with some of the ideas being expressed there. And I want to go back a little further than that, because I think these ideas of history, the ideas of uncertainty, are very important to understanding why I will argue that this is not an issue for regulation of reporting at least.